Video 100. I am not gonna lie, I never thought I would get here. Let alone be here with almost 120,000 of you joining me along the way. There has always been a video that I wanted to make for this occasion, a video on a topic that is extremely important to someone who is extremely important to me. And so today I'm going to tell you a story of a boy called Teddy. A tale of an Anzac that is completely unknown outside of a very, very small circle of people. I'm talking maybe 3 or 4 people. But a story that travels alongside the giants of history, alongside the birth of modern war, a birth of a nation, and how it all, to this day, led to me sitting here talking to you about history. How all of these events played alongside one another to lead us to this very point. Welcome to the tale of the Anzac I guarantee you have never heard of. This story begins in Winchester, England, where a young boy called Alfred was born on the 27th of October 1857. Alfred was the second son to a man called William Humphreys, and his wife and 2 brothers who grew up working as carpenters, a trait that their descendants over a century and a half later continued through their distant relative, a man called Kenneth. Alfred would meet a woman named Sophia in 1879, and they would continue their lives in England, having 2 daughters until finally they boarded an immigrant ship, the Duke of Devonshire, on the 18th of August 1883. The ship would arrive in Cooktown, in the colony of Queensland, October of that year, after a relatively quick voyage that saw the birth and death of another daughter to the couple. Alfred, Sophia and their children would disembark in Cooktown and make their way south to Brisbane. It was here that tragedy struck the family, with their daughters both taking sick and dying, leaving the couple now with an infant son called Charles Oscar. With the heartbreak keenly felt and the birth of a few other children, the couple took their sons north to Apple Tree Creek, where they would settle, raising a family of 6 boys and 1 further daughter. It is their youngest son, Sophia's little boy Edward, born on the 8th of September 1897, that we will talk about today, because while he himself is largely lost to the pages of history and is quite insignificant in the grand scheme of things, he walked among and alongside giants at events that shaped our modern world. As Edward grew up in rural Queensland to the sound of trains, horses and carpenters plying their trade on farmland, he lived through some incredibly formative events. At only 4 years old, he witnessed the birth of the nation of Australia, once a collection of colonies, now an infant country with a future ahead of it. By all accounts, he was his mum's favourite, even as he reached adulthood. There aren't too many accounts of his upbringing particularly, but from what I have been able to gather, he was a bit of, as my mum would say, a shit. Not shying away from trouble and always incredibly cheeky, but always willing to put his hand up for what he thought was right, and to help when he thought help was needed. Some anecdotal accounts say that he liked sport, enjoying rugby, but this would have been common amongst boys his age, and after all he was a Queenslander and rugby is kind of in the blood up there. Just before his 17th birthday though, something would happen that would set him on a date with destiny. The Archduke of Austria's car would take a wrong turn, and shots would ring out, killing the heir to the Habsburg throne and his wife, which then plunged Europe into war. Although Teddy didn't know it yet, the clock had just started. The infant Australia, ready to prove itself to the mother country, followed suit when war broke out in 1914. Having federated only 13 years earlier, many Australians felt a strong sense of loyalty to Britain, seeing participation in the war as both a duty to the Empire, the King, and an opportunity for adventure. Teddy was one of these young people eager to prove himself, to see the world and to do his duty, but he was only 16 and his mother kept a close eye on him to prevent him lying about his age. And so while he watched on as the boys in the town marched out, the Australian Imperial Force, or AIF, made up entirely of volunteers, was formed. After an eventful voyage to Egypt that included the naval battle between HMAS Sydney and SMS Emden, they arrived and trained together under the shadows of the pyramids before being sent to join the attempt to capture the Gallipoli Peninsula in modern-day Turkey. The goal was to open a sea route to Russia through the Dardanelles, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and shift the stalemated Western Front. On the morning of the 25th of April 1915, Australian and New Zealand troops, later collectively known as Anzacs, landed at what would become today known as Anzac Cove. The landing was immediately chaotic. The troops faced steep cliffs, tangled scrub, and fierce Turkish resistance led by none other than Mustafa Kemal. You may know him today as Ataturk, the father of modern-day Turkey. The intended easy advance inland turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Within hours, hundreds of Australians were killed or wounded, and the entire invasion force found itself trapped in a narrow strip of beach overlooked by well-entrenched Ottoman defenders. For the next 8 months, the Australians endured appalling conditions. The heat, flies, lack of sanitation, and shortage of water made life miserable in the trenches. Disease and infection were also constant threats, often claiming more lives than the combat. Yet despite the hardship, Australian soldiers displayed a remarkable endurance, humour, and camaraderie, a trait we know today as mateship. They dug in, they built tunnels, they built trenches, and continued to fight with such a ferocity that they earned a reputation for courage, aggression, and resourcefulness. This built a mutual respect between the Turks that endured after the war, particularly with their leader Ataturk. The Gallipoli campaign, though, would ultimately fail because the Allied forces could not break through, and after months of stalemate with heavy casualties, the decision was made to evacuate. The blame was thrown on Winston Churchill as a scapegoat, Ian Hamilton got away with it, and the people tried to forget the whole affair. The withdrawal itself in December 1915 was the most successful operation of the entire campaign, actually. It was carried out with almost no losses thanks to inventions such as the self-firing rifle. In total, 8,000 Australian sons remained at Gallipoli, never to come home, with scores more taken down as casualties. This campaign would resonate around the world. It would be the first time the Australian flag was seen on the battlefield, the first time the rising sun and the slouch hat would be worn to combat, the first time the emu plumes would be seen charging across no man's land, and it led to a massive campaign for more recruits. Not that this campaign was entirely needed, because tens of thousands of young Australians were ready to go, ready to sign up and do what they saw as their duty. Just as a sidebar here, the image I'm using for Edward that you can see on screen now, I'm not 100% sure it is him. It is included with his official documents as part of the National Archives of Australia. However, it very well could be a relation of his during the Second World War using an older uniform, because it was also kept alongside Second World War medal photos in the World War I archive, so I think some lines have been crossed somewhere. Just keep that in mind. It does kind of match his physical description on his enlistment records, so for that reason I've decided to use it, but just please keep that in mind, it may not entirely be accurate here. Edward would celebrate his 18th birthday in September 1915, and there are two prevailing stories about what happened next. The first is that he quietly left a few days later, leaving no inclination about where he was going, although everyone knew, and the other was that he sat his parents down and told them that he was a man now and he was going to do his part. I for one am inclined to believe the second one from what I have read, but it is worth mentioning as both of these actions were common during the war for individuals. But no matter what the reasoning was, Edward, now 18, made his way south to Brisbane, and on the 21st of September 1915, he made the oath. And so, young Edward, 18 years old and standing at 5 feet 9 inches, proudly donned the uniform that he'd been seeking since the outbreak of the war, giving his life on the farmlands of central Queensland up. As part of his joining, he signed a will too. A simple one. In the event of my death, I leave all to Mrs. A. Humphreys, his mum. Edward did keep a journal, however sadly, as I will mention later, it is now missing, so we don't know exactly what he thought or got up to over the next few years, but I do have his medical and service records, so I can tell you a few things, and I'll do my best to fill in the blanks. Edward would leave Australia in early 1916 aboard the transport ship HMAT Commonwealth, and would later arrive in Egypt, where for a time he would first stay in Suez and then later Alexandria at a military hospital. It would be here that young Edward would be treated for a venereal disease, likely caught from one of the many establishments in Egypt that serviced the strapping young men passing through. What makes this period kind of funny is that his mum was keeping tabs on what Teddy was up to, and she was less than pleased to discover what her son was in hospital for during his time in Egypt, because she wrote a letter to his commanding major to check up on him and to make sure it wasn't happening again. During this time, he would be promoted to Lance Corporal, and after 4 months convalescing he would be transferred to the 15th Battalion, Australian Imperial Force in France, where he would serve across the line, regularly being admitted for increasingly worse cases of trench foot to military hospitals. The 15th would see incredibly fierce combat during this time period, being in action at places such as Messines Ridge, Passchendaele, the Somme, Ypres, Polygon Wood, just to name a few. These are battles that are remembered for incredibly high casualty rates, and it is clear that from this revolving door of trench foot episodes and records that Edward saw significant action during this time. Edward's luck, though, was running out, and as his unit came under the command of Sir John Monash, Teddy's time on this earth was being counted in weeks, not months. By mid-1918, the war on the Western Front had reached a critical stage. The German Spring Offensive had been launched earlier in the year, backed by the divisions of men now free following the collapse of the Russian Empire. Operation Michael, the Kaiser's Great Offensive, had been incredibly successful so far, and it pushed the Allies back, but crucially, it failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. The Allied armies, now under the overall command of General Ferdinand Foch, reorganising and preparing for counterattacks. Among the key leaders was Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, an Australian commander who had recently taken charge of the Australian Imperial Force, now known as the Australian Corps, the largest single corps on the Western Front, numbering at its peak nearly 200,000 men. For fun facts on Sir John Monash, he's considered in many ways the father of combined arms warfare. He was the last soldier to ever be knighted in the field by a reigning British monarch as well, just to give you an idea of the quality of the man's leadership. And to add on top of that, he did all this while fighting his own government because he was the son of Prussian-born immigrants, and also he was Jewish, which was a big no-no for certain people in high command. Monash, though, was an engineer by trade, and a very practical and meticulous man. He believed that modern battles shouldn't be fought with charging, but they should be fought with precision, coordination, and minimal unnecessary sacrifice of life. A belief that has led to him being venerated in modern Australian society. Now free of his upper command, the Battle of Hamel was the first opportunity for him to put these theories into practice. The objective of the battle was relatively modest. It was to capture the village of La Hamel and the surrounding high ground. This formed a bit of a salient to the German lines. Although the goal was limited, the operation was designed as a test case for Monash's new combined arms strategy. He integrated infantry, tanks, and artillery and aircraft into a single tightly coordinated plan. The assault force included 4 Australian infantry brigades and a contingent of American troops. What's remarkable here is that this is the first time ever that US soldiers fought not just under Australian but foreign command. His plan relied on precision and timing. The attack began at 3:10 am on the 4th of July, timed perfectly in order to ensure that the advancing troops would benefit from the dim pre-dawn light. Artillery opened up with a creeping barrage that moved forward at a steady rate, protecting the advancing soldiers while disrupting the enemy and deafening them. Behind the barrage, infantry advanced alongside 60 British Mark V tanks that the soldiers had spent weeks drilling with. It was their job to crush wire obstacles and neutralise machine gun nests. Meanwhile, as the Anglo-American force advanced, Monash tasked aircraft to drop ammunition resupply to the advancing troops, conducting what was in effect one of the first uses of air resupply in modern combat. The coordination was remarkable. Within just 93 minutes the objectives had been achieved, and the village of Hamel was securely in Allied hands. The success story cost, though, 1,400 Allied casualties, although this was a relatively low figure given the scale of the victory. German losses were significantly higher, at more than 1,500 prisoners alone being captured. The victory was not only tactical but psychological. It proved that well-planned combined arms operations would break the stalemate of trench warfare. This battle today is considered Monash's masterpiece, the first true example of combined arms warfare employing shock and awe. It was so effective that this kind of operation would be repeated again during the 100 Days Offensive, the offensive that would break the Hindenburg Line and ultimately defeat the Imperial German Army. But of the 1,400 casualties, and the dozens of men who lay dead, there was one young man, a now 19-year-old boy from Queensland, who lay lifeless in a ditch. We don't know exactly how it happened, but we have a pretty good idea from some witnesses, and of course later from his body. During the early stages of the advance towards Hamel, Edward and another digger by the name of R. Ryan were pushing toward the German position when their unit came under fire. The two men allegedly took cover in a shell crater where they were last seen. Between the witness allegedly seeing these men and following units pushing forward to the crater, it was struck by a large caliber artillery shell that killed both men likely instantaneously. When Edward's parents received the news, it cannot be understated just how much it ruined his mother. She was a complete mess. Her little baby boy was gone, but what hurt her the most was that she couldn't hold on to anything of his. She couldn't bury him. He wasn't just dead, it was like he had stopped existing, and so her war began. Alfred and Sophia would take the news quite differently. No strangers to losing children, they had unfortunately had some practice in this field. Alfred, for his part, would remain a brick wall, shattered by the loss of his youngest boy, but refusing to show it. For Sophia, though, her heartbreak went in the space of mere months from sadness to anger, and then determination. She would have something of her son to remember him. She would have his body buried safely, no matter how long it took her. As I mentioned in the beginning, Edward's will dictated that his belongings would go to Mrs. A. Humphreys, as in Sophia Humphreys, Mrs. being she is the wife of Alfred Humphreys. These items included his wallet, journal, paybook, and really any medals or awards he was set to receive. With the war increasing in tempo, though, his death announced by the arrival of a simple telegram saying he'd been killed in action wasn't given much attention by the powers that be. So Sophia began a letter-writing campaign, first getting her husband to inquire and then herself, alone, beginning a one-woman's army campaign against the government and the entire imperial system to find out what happened to her son. She would reach out over and over again. I have pages of letters of her reaching out to find news of her boy, and every time she would get a simple, almost templated response saying there was no news. But for Sophia, this simply wasn't good enough. It didn't matter how long it would take, it didn't matter if there was a war, it didn't matter if the entire British Empire was burning. She wanted to know what happened to her boy. Eventually, she broke through in late 1919 when she was informed that he had died in France, which she already knew. But those who had died in France, including her son, would be exhumed from temporary burials and re-interned to dedicated war graves. This was a start, but it didn't give her anything that she really wanted, so she resumed, burning through a fortune in paper and ink before finally at last a package arrived in the post containing a paybook, a little journal, and later on, 3 medals: the 1914-15 Star, the British War Medal, and the Victory Medal. At last, she had something to hold on to. But for Sophia, this wasn't good enough. She wanted to know where her boy's body was, what happened to him. Eventually, she annoyed enough people that somebody was actually sent looking, and she received a telegram stating that he was buried in northwest France near Agincourt. Over the next 2 decades, Australian soldiers would be exhumed across the Western Front and re-interned in the town of Villers-Bretonneux, just a few miles away from the Hamel. It was in this town that Australian forces had distinguished themselves earlier in the war, forcing the Germans from it, and in fact to this day the primary school in this town, the children still learn the anthem of Australia. And in 1932, the French government, along with Australia's government, erected a great monument flanked by the Australian flag and the tricolour. One of the grave markers in this cemetery, though, bears 2 names, E. Humphreys and R. Ryan. The 2 men, found together, a mess of bone and cloth, were unable to be separated. The 2 diggers died together, and they lay together to this day in the shadow of the monument's tower. Sophia and Alfred would receive a telegram finally telling them after so much waiting that their son was buried here, that he finally had a resting place. It was only now, years later, that Sophia would end her campaign. But why did I tell you this story? Well, it's because Edward's older brother would marry a woman called Pearl Irwin, and they would have a daughter called Adela. Adela is my grandmother, a woman who I never had the privilege to meet, but I know her daughter, and this video in many ways is a gift to my mum, because the story of Edward, it's a story that is told 66,000 times over in Australia during World War I, and yet with the exception of those who achieved fame, it's so often completely forgotten, and one day, when the older members of the family die, these stories will be forgotten. For me, myself, I look up to Edward quite a bit. Not for his willingness to obviously go and die in France, but for the fact when the world was going to hell, he stood up for what he believed in. It's something that resonates with me and has always resonated with me ever since I found this story when I was probably 13 years old. This video exists specifically so that the story of Edward Humphreys is not one of those that is forgotten in a generation or two's time, now that all of those who served in the First World War and almost all of those who served in the Second, have themselves passed on. Sadly, Edward's notebook, as I mentioned, along with his medals, can't, despite my best efforts, be located. I believe the medals were sold during the Great Depression when the family fell on hard times, but that's just a suspicion. I can't really prove anything, and I hope they weren't. Edward's specific notebook, there are some letters that survive from him that went to his mother in 1916 and such, and they're very much cases of, "Hi Mum, doing well, everything's alright, this is what's going on," very, very sensitive, of course. But the actual individual notebook, I don't know what happened to it. I have seen one document that says he was buried with his mother, and it was something that she took to the grave, which I can see occurring, but I can't prove it, and, well, I'm not going to go and exhume my great-great-great-great-grandmother, so we'll just have to accept that it's lost to history. But either way, thank you all for joining me for this very, very niche video. 100 down, 100 more to go, and maybe when we hit video 200 we can do something special. Like, comment, subscribe, check out the Patreon if you want to, and I will catch you all next time.